you, Daniel. Thank you, Dean Muslek, and thank you all for being here, and especially thanks to Glennon to be here to make some remarks following my comments. And I would say, Jonathan, also thank you for reminding us about Aaron Nelson, because I actually, and you clearly are ahead of the game, because I met him at a conference on corporate governance, believe it or not, about 10 years ago. So it's clearly you're great minds. It is a special pleasure to be here in Dublin. And the reason I say that is because 33 years ago, the world of modern corporate governance was founded just a few blocks from here. The Irish Association of Investment Managers, under its then executive director, Anne Fitzgerald, started this whole phenomenon with the world's first ever code of corporate governance. Now, almost nobody knows this because it was almost immediately overshadowed, literally within months, by the UK's Cadbury Code. And Cadbury became a global standard. Actually, Ireland ultimately embraced the Cadbury Code. But I think it's just important to remember that corporate governance really started here. And Ireland sort of pointed the way. And in the same way, I'm sure the Corporate Governance Lab, this is a very timely moment. We're in a moment of ferment and turmoil in the corporate governance world, and the time is exactly right for the kind of research and scholarship and innovation promised by the center. I'm particularly delighted that Daniel is heading it. Daniel and I have known each other for many years, and you could really have nobody better in terms of being aware of global scholarship and being able to really lead innovation. So I salute Trinity and the business school in particular. So as one would expect in a lab, I'm going to speak today about innovation in our field, which has experienced, of course, a whirlwind of change in recent years. And what I'd like to do is to talk about some of the international trends that have arisen and how we can think about taking them forward. There has been, of course, as I mentioned, really an onslaught of crises that have upended assumptions about business and investment. You think about the pandemic, about the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, sharply elevated political risk, even in once stable jurisdictions, such as my home country, tensions over energy markets, climate shifts, supply chain disruptions, growing nationalism, and a populist backlash against globalization. All of these trends have caused great disruption in corporate governance and in the business world in general. But in my address today, what I'd like to do is to talk about what I would call the three big estates of corporate governance. That is to say, regulators, investors, and corporate boards. And I'd like to, in each case, think about how they are innovating out of or through these crises, sometimes in ways that are largely hidden from view. So let me start with regulators. Before the pandemic, the prevailing public policy model in North America, the European Union, and Japan was that governments should largely stay clear of prescriptive regulation on environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, factors Instead, the view was that governments would empower investors to police markets on corporate behavior, mainly because governments really aren't capable of keeping track of the rapidity of change. So what they felt was, we've got to enlist investors to help police markets. But now, however, grassroots public pressure has grown around the world for business to act responsibly on social interests, whether on drug prices in the pandemic or gas or energy prices in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Exhibit A is really just, in today's headlines. There's public fury over record oil company profits as energy prices rise and supplies constrict. Policymakers, not surprisingly, whether they are regulators or lawmakers, are quickly scrapping that laissez-faire approach for instead and moving toward the idea of intervention. In the case of energy, some have opted for big new incentives for alternative fuels, for example. But rulemaking is moving well beyond that into the whole ESG space. To cite just one example, the European Parliament last year approved, as you probably know, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Initiative, or Directive, which will soon require, beginning in 2024, EU companies to make detailed ESG disclosures, not just on financial materiality, but on how they impact society. The Biden administration in the United States took a sharp U-turn from the Trump era, with forthcoming, sometime soon, we hope, SEC requirements on boards to disclose against fresh standards, such as human capital management. Of course, the conviction is hardly new that companies have social obligations to fulfill. Investors have asserted that as an expectation, at least in most non-Anglo markets, literally since the first ever example of shareholder activism, which occurred at the Dutch East India Company in 1609. So shareholder activism on social issues as well as financial issues has a more than 400-year-old history. But now boards worldwide face a whole new set of reporting and behavioral expectations to prove that they are earning their, quote, license to operate. Now, the thing is about the regulation is that it's like a pendulum, so it swings the other way too. We're now seeing in the United States a powerful backlash against ESG. Last year, in a May 10th speech, the then vice president, or rather the former vice president of the United States, Mike Pence, delivered a speech in which he effectively opened a new front in politics, calling on the United States to, quote, rein in the rights of funds to engage in ESG investing. And he blasted the practice as elevating, quote, left-wing objectives, unquote. Other Republican lawmakers have since taken up the call, branding companies and investors who address ESG as showing, quote, wokeism, unquote. The state of Texas has even passed legislation banning fund companies such as BlackRock from managing state money, pension fund money, for example, because they are said to be anti-fossil fuels. So now, with Republicans in control of the United States Federal House of Representatives, that anti-ESG movement, which is largely funded, I might add, according to reports, buying fossil fuel interests, sees weekly advances in attacks against sustainability standards. And anti-ESG advocates are trying to export their perspectives to Europe. We can talk more about this later if you like. But here's where innovation arises. A few years ago, ESMA, the European Securities Market Authority, introduced a new concept which it called, quote, monitored self-regulation, unquote. The target was, at that time, the proxy advisory industry. That is, the firms that advise institutional investors on how to vote at shareholder meetings around the world. It is, as you know, a highly controversial industry, especially among CEOs. CEOs react strongly when such advisors recommend against board members, or for that matter, against the practices of management, or when they sometimes get facts wrong about the companies. Corporations have long clamored for regulation of the industry. Well, ESMA heard that call, but also understood that black-letter regulation can be rigid and can suppress originality. So instead, ESMA pressed the proxy advisory industry for principles of best practice. Further, ESMA insisted that stakeholders be empowered to scrutinize industry member compliance with those principles. So I was the founding chair of the independent oversight committee that monitors the proxy voting advisory and research industry. And that body is delivering, I would argue, results without the need for harsh regulation. Indeed, both ESMA and the United States Securities Exchange Commission have affirmed that they see this path of monitored self-regulation as a route for fruitful alternatives in other industries. ESMA, for example, is considering monitored self-regulation for other controversial areas in the capital market, such as opening ground, which is in effect opening ground between doing nothing and doing too much. So they're looking, for example, to apply that practice to ESG advisory services, which are now many all over the world. And of course, the OECD has recently also innovated with a revised set of G20 OECD corporate governance principles. They were released only a month or so ago. And they again talk about voluntary compliance. So we're seeing regulators trying to think outside the box instead of going with the easy route of just coming up with laws and regulations. So one of the areas that the Corporate Governance Lab here can perhaps look at is what are the most effective models for governance regulation given the market's changing characteristics. So let me shift for a moment from regulators to a second great estate of corporate governance, which is to say, the investors. And what I'll talk about is something called investor stewardship, which some of you may be familiar with. Well, first, there's no doubt that investors are moving rapidly to active stewardship. And by definition, stewardship is, quote, the exercise of responsible care by an agent acting on behalf of an ultimate owner. Now, that's at least what the dictionary says. But what does stewardship really mean? Well, we know that the investor world has long been about buying and selling shares. What's arisen parallel to the trading discipline is the discipline of stewardship. Stewardship is what you do with shares once you own them in order to optimize value over time, and perhaps to ensure that portfolio companies align with investor expectations. Now that means not just voting shares as an investor, but also engaging with companies and other players as well. Big institutional investors have doubled or tripled the number of people who work on stewardship in just the last 5 years. Moreover, with these stewardship professionals who used to be marginal players within the funds, now having much more power at the heart of investment shops, the whole market has changed dramatically. As these stewardship professionals begin further to engage with portfolio companies, they are raising questions of ESG risk and opportunity in board composition, climate, employee health and safety, and a host of other issues. When the pandemic hit, the question was whether this relatively new discipline of stewardship would thrive or whether it would wither away in a bear market or a poor business environment. Well, we can now conclude the answer to that question, which is that there is no evidence that it's a fair market trend. Indeed, lawmakers and regulations continue to press for muscular stewardship by institutional investors, not least by ever upping the standards of corporate disclosure, handing share owners a rising tide of information to absorb and stimulate action. Moreover, if we think about innovation, one advance comes in the form of a fresh effort to build global infrastructure around the stewardship profession through an initiative called STEPS, or Stewardship Professionals. Some of you today may be involved in that project, as am I. Just days ago, STEPS, after several years of development, began offering professional courses leading to a global stewardship test and certification. So it will answer a vital question that's been around now for the last 5 to 10 years, which is, what do you need to know to be an effective investor steward? But where innovation is really being introduced in the investor world may be understood in the context of the new anti-ESG movement I mentioned earlier. Critics of ESG assert that stewardship is grounded in left-wing political and social biases and should therefore be scrapped in favor of evidence-based, value-growing support for business executives and boards. Well, the truth is that stewardship is grounded, more so each day, on a vast new industry of analytics providers. And here, where context is in order, ESG was conjured in 2005 as a term, as really a shorthand for 3 factors then tagged as, quote, intangibles. That is, factors that are outside the conventional scope of quantifiable risks that companies face. But back then, few had any idea how to measure, let alone to manage, how a corporation or an investment institution might deploy ESG in everyday work. Worse, research was scant and divided on how ESG factors might relate to long-term success. If investors or companies opted for an ESG lens 2 decades ago, it was largely out of conviction, born of ethics, or guesswork. Today, what was once intangible is now the subject of a web of technical disclosure rules and standards, matched by a vast and growing industry devoted to calculating the precise effects of ESG on business and on fund success. Want to see how a company is faring compared to peers on water usage, energy efficiency, employee turnover, accident rates, or community trust? There are troves of big data on that. Someone is measuring each of those within an inch of their lives. Want to see the level of a mutual fund's exposure to greenhouse gases? Again, somebody is computing it. So investor stewardship professionals are daily conducting detailed, granular testing of portfolio company performance using both corporate information and externally sourced big data and AI. Such data allow them either to express their confidence in boards or to challenge them to do better. So investor stewardship is very much grounded now in evidence. Whether it is the right evidence, of course, is another debate. But institutions are also drawing on innovation to demonstrate that their stewardship programs are aligned not with leftist ideology, but with the interests and preferences of their beneficiary clients. In 2021, BlackRock introduced a, quote, pass-through voting, unquote, service whereby its larger investor clients can actually cast their ballots themselves rather than using BlackRock to do that. Others are taking similar steps. And there are other institutions, Schwab being the latest, which are now incorporating new polling tools to anchor their stewardship priorities to those of clients. One of the big funds in the UK, LGIM, Legal & General Investment Management, together with Aviva and Fidelity International, also based in Britain, are doing this using a startup financial fintech firm called Tumelo. And at the same time, big EU asset managers, such as PGGM and APG in the Netherlands, have been long practiced in using classic opinion gathering techniques, again, to find out what do their underlying beneficiaries, the ordinary people that are really the capital providers in the world, what do they want these funds to do in respect of ESG? So given all that context, that innovation, it may, I would suspect, be much harder for critics going forward to attack funds on ESG stewardship if their strategies are anchored both in hard data and in client opinion. Still, in my view, a further innovation could be to replace ESG as a term. I first suggested this in a post on LinkedIn in June 2022, and it drew what was to me a remarkable number of 39,000 views. There's clearly an appetite for discussing this issue. And my proposal at the time was to pivot to a phrase that returns us to the original concept of ensuring that both investors and companies take account of risks and opportunities that lie outside conventional accounting. I suggested calling it 360-degree investing, or for companies, 360-degree management. That expression, at least to me, would signal that investors and directors are looking at the full range of insights, including ESG, of course, but also others that don't necessarily fit nicely in that ESG category, that legitimately affect long-term value. Now, such a change might not satisfy political detractors, but it was really what was meant all along with the term ESG. Again, perhaps a fruitful area for the lab would be to explore what the next dimension of ESG should look like. So finally, let me turn to the third biggest stake of corporate governance, which is, of course, corporate boards. Crises have come like serial cyclones to companies, and we doubtless have people in this room who have come through them, learning much about how best to navigate them. But one thing crises have done, as I mentioned earlier, is to turbocharge investor stewardship. Are corporate boards ready for that? Innovation here would involve stress testing a board against the new challenges to make sure it has directors, for instance, with skills in two-way communication, and an ESG, or 360-degree management, balance sheet that can pass muster against current investor opinion. Does the board have the information it needs? Is it a backward-looking monoculture, or is it best structured to act on that information? Crises have brought another consequence, a tide of pressure on companies to address political and social issues, whether it be on public health, the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, climate, political stability, gender equity, or employee rights. Staying clear of such issues and suffering no effects is no longer a realistic option. For example, in the United States, a group of CEOs joined in a statement following the January 6th, 2020 insurrection at the United States Capitol. They asserted support for democratic institutions, which made sense because US political stability is an essential component of business growth. Many others, though, chose not to get involved. Either way, there were effects. Criticism from some that companies should be silent, and from others that more companies should speak out. Disney got entangled in such a case regarding gender issues in Florida not that long ago. Adidas last year had to disengage from Kanye West over racism and anti-Semitism charges. Coca-Cola and more than 1,000 other multinationals had to exit Russia under public pressure following Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And today, corporate leaders are being asked, as are university chancellors and deans and others, to demonstrate moral clarity on issues such as Israel and Gaza. One hedge fund manager, Bill Ackman, has recently and prominently asserted that companies hiring new staff should weigh whether job candidates participated in anti-Semitic actions on university campuses. So this is the kind of direction in which a member of parties in the capital market are moving. Innovation here involves investment by big companies and their boards in better intelligence information on geopolitical risks facing their businesses, as well as risks arising from investors, from NGOs, and public pressure. Boards need alignment with their stakeholders, especially their investors, but also other parts of society. They need competence, they need insight, and they need ethics. We saw all of those go into failure in the recent case, for example, of OpenAI, and there are others, no doubt, ahead of us, especially perhaps in Silicon Valley, which has notoriously terrible corporate governance. It may also involve updating the job description for chairs and CEOs to include the kind of communication and public policy judgment skills that we normally associate with politics more than business. Once again, perhaps the Trinity Corporate Governance Lab can explore the role of board directors and the CEO as social pressures invade the boardroom. So let me conclude with this. I said at the outset that there are 3 big estates of corporate governance, but actually there are 4, but that last is inchoate and the toughest to integrate into practice. I'm talking about the hundreds of millions of citizen investors around the world who are shareholders of public companies, whether they know it or not, or whether they want to or not. But they are through their investment, through their retirement or pension savings, if they're lucky to have those. In the United States alone, Federal Reserve figures quite recently showed that a record 58% of American households own stock directly or indirectly. Now, I spent a good chunk of my life arguing that citizen investors need a way into the system, both to optimize their long-term savings and to allow them to align their values with the financial agents they hire and with the portfolio companies in which they invest. They are, after all, the ultimate source of capital, yet are commonly powerless, or worse, financially mistreated. So today, innovation is arising here. The pass-through voting startup firm Tumelo that I mentioned earlier is one example. But there is lots more to do. Another challenge, perhaps, for the lab. There is more to discuss, and so I look forward to Professor Clark's comments and hope there will be time for further Q&A. But for now, thank you so much for listening. And again, congratulations to all on the launch of the Trinity Corporate Governance Lab.